It's Friday, March 24th, 2017. Today on the Broke Canadian Newscast,
we'll be covering the budget. Oh, sorry, the provincial one.
We'll also be covering the budget, the national budget.
And we'll also be covering the budget, the one from the States.
I'm Bandringer.
And I'm the Dino Man.
And this is
the Broke Canadian Newscast. Budget Extravaganza.
Very extra. Very ganza.
There are two guys with more time than money to spare, discussing local to world affairs. There's Bandringer first with the Dino Man last. Here's the Broke Canadian Newscast.
So how's your week been?
Oh, week's been pretty good. It's, I've been out doing tons of stuff with people. I was out late night with karaoke with Cody last night.
Sounds fun. Did you sing any great songs?
I sang in my falsetto far too much, so my voice might be a little hoarse today.
What was your falsetto staples for the night?
I don't know. Goodbye Stranger, ABC by the Jackson 5. Yeah.
Did you Take on Me by Aha?
I did.
I know your staples.
You know my staples.
Staples for busting out the sexy falsetto girly voice.
Woohoo!
Yeah, great. So I've been pretty well. I'm excited to get into a all-budget, all-numbers edition of the Broke Canadian Newscast.
You've had enough to drink to ready yourself for it?
I mean, I've required
some.
I don't know. Let's not go into that, okay? This is gonna be a in-depth, very budget edition because
very professional,
very budget. Much wow as the memes that the dank memes, in fact, that the
from the interwebs
of the doges and their coins. They have coins, the doges?
They do have coins, although those coins are depreciating, I'm pretty sure.
Are they depreciating? Okay.
I think they've depreciated and now they're fairly stagnant because the 6 people that use them are using them somewhat steadily.
Is Dogecoin still sponsoring a NASCAR driver?
I believe they are, actually.
Okay, good to know. Let's get into some updates after that digression.
Yeah. So I guess with regards to what we were just talking about last week,
yeah,
M103 passed. Not really a big surprise.
Last week, it was the week before.
Oh, it was the week before.
I believe so. Right. I believe so. Last week. What was our local? No, it's Garland last week.
Right. So yeah, 2 weeks ago, M103, we talked about it. It has passed. It's not really a big surprise, but there you go.
Yeah, it was passed by a fairly large margin, as 2 of the 3 major parties in Parliament voted for it, as well as a few from the Conservative caucus.
Yep. 1
or 2 Liberals either abstained or voted against, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there was an abstention of at least one Liberal MNA based on concerns of his constituents.
Okay. Fair enough.
But no, it passed, which means that, as we discussed before, Sharia law will now be effect. We now need the testimony of 2 women for every man.
Of course.
And
the law is now in place.
The Sharia law is now in place, so remember to everyone to wear their hijabs or najabs or headscarves. Okay? Just keep that in mind.
Alright. I think that's all that we have for updates.
Okay.
A few will pop up in the stories today, though, I'm sure.
Oh, yes.
Well, speaking of the stories today, let's jump into local news.
Let's jump into it.
So, a few weeks ago, we were talking about the fiscal update for Alberta.
Yeah?
Well, the budget's now come out. So we actually have solid numbers to work with, and this is for the upcoming year. Let's just go through the big numbers that you should know. So first off, we're looking at $45 billion in revenue. About $21.8 billion of that is taxes. Mm-hmm. The rest is other sources of revenue.
A lot of that other sources are transfers from the federal government.
True. There are a lot of that. And some of those are specific to certain areas, which we will get into either in this segment or the next.
Yep.
And we are spending about $55 billion in expenditures, which gives us about a $10 billion deficit, right? And that's really where a large amount of the conversation of this is focused.
Yes.
Is on that deficit and given the economy and all this jazz and how oil's doing, if that's wise. But those are the big numbers we're working with.
Yeah, some of the things that we're spending on, which is causing us to have a bit of that deficit, a lot of infrastructure spending, $9.2 billion for capital spending.
Which is pretty much a deficit, bear in mind.
Yeah, bear in mind. So, a lot of it for, in very local news, a new hospital in Edmonton, new schools in Edmonton and Calgary, plus a modernization of mental health services at the Royal Alexandria, money for modernization at the Misericordia, long-term care facilities, and a new courthouse in Red Deer. So
long-term care in Calgary, new courthouse in Red Deer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying. So, both updates to current facilities and new facilities to accommodate our growing population. Mm-hmm. There are no major tax increases, no new income taxes, no new taxes on tobacco and alcohol. The taxes are remaining flat.
Yeah. Or steady, not flat, but because we don't have a flat tax rate. But
how many times will you correct me on
your semantics?
Semantics, yes, that is correct.
All the time, so long as clarification is needed. You can feel free to correct me on mine.
Okay, but
it's a give and take relationship.
I think people realize that we don't have a flat tax, and then when I say the tax will remain flat, I mean that there will not be increase in tax, especially since that's what I said in the previous sentence.
True. Yes.
Okay, so
all right, I'll give you that one.
You can get off my back. So my back is starting to hurt from you jumping on top of it all the time.
All right, I'll get off.
You're riding it.
like a certain children's toy?
We are not referencing that because no one in the audience is going to get that. No one is going to reference the exact video that we watched before the show in our preparation time.
Google Pony Up Daddy.
Oh boy. No, okay guys.
Anyway,
we're getting off the rails already.
Back to the news. So we did talk about the deficit, which is, bear in mind, about $500 million less than last year's deficit.
Yep.
Even though it is still like $10.3 billion.
Yeah.
The provincial debt that thereby would climb to $45 billion this year.
Yep.
And by 2019-2020, it's expected to be around $71 billion.
Yep.
Now, there's not really any plan to pay off this debt until going into 2023, 2024.
A long way off, anyway.
So quite a ways off before. I'm guessing we will have a very different government at that time.
Who knows?
But we'll see. Now, the important part to talk about the debt is always with the debt servicing costs. So those are climbing from about $1.3 billion this year. They will be $2.3 billion next year, but that's still about 3% of the debt.
$2.3 billion next year. I believe that's actually $2.3 billion in 2019.
Right, sorry.
Yeah.
2.3 in 2019,
just to be clear there.
Yeah, say it. Correct me.
Yeah, but my correction was an actual point of fact, not on a possible misconstruence of my wordy sayings.
All right. So we had interest about the carbon tax this year.
Yeah.
And once again, it's going to bring in just over $1 billion.
Yes, so not a huge percentage of revenue.
No, not at all.
And a lot of that is going to be reinvested into sustainable initiatives.
Yes, that's all being allocated for specific purposes. It's not general fund.
Now one can definitely, still, as we talked about before, make the argument that this tax should be revenue neutral. And if the government wants to raise revenues, or wants or needs to raise revenues, that they can do that through other means, income or corporate taxes, even alcohol or tobacco taxes. But it does give to some degree of an appearance of trying to sneak revenues in through the guise of being environmentally friendly.
Yeah.
There is definitely an argument to be made for a revenue neutral tax. As we talked about before, divorcing climate change from the government's coffers.
Yes. Which I do believe they've taken some steps to try to do, but as always, you can always go further.
Yeah.
Now, also with this budget, our growth in spending, therefore, with all these expenditures, including slight ones to health and education, social services, all that jazz.
Yeah.
It's going to be about 2.2%. And last year it was 3.9%.
Yeah.
Of an increase in operational spending. So we are increasing spending, but it is fairly marginal. Now, one of the most interesting things, which I did want to bring up about this budget, is the provincial government is finally allocating money to improve water and upgrade their facilities at First Nations reserves. $100 million.
Yep.
This might strike some people the wrong way, but if you actually know about how the infrastructure,
I don't think it's striking many people the wrong way.
No.
Let's be real here.
But this is money that just needed to be spent, and
Yes.
the kick hand has been kicked down the road for how many bloody times? It's good that we're finally getting something done with this, and not just pretty words.
Yeah, there's way too many reserves, native communities that are without safe drinking water, that have to boil water, that have to buy drinking water from neighboring communities. It just is an undue burden, and it's frankly shameful.
It is.
Frankly shameful that in a, top 7, however many affluent country, first world developed country, we have the people that were here before any of us white people, that they do not have access to drinking water. That is just a complete travesty. And this should have been done so many years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And it's good that they're starting to do that now. And I hope that more money gets invested in that in the future, because it is deplorable.
And here's the thing that really strikes me is we're talking about a budget here, right? We're talking about $10 billion in deficit, but $55 billion of spending.
Yeah.
This is $100 million they've allocated. Now, I'm assuming that this is going to go fairly far.
Yeah.
It's amazing that we've put off spending that little amount of money in the grand scheme of things for so long. That's what shocks me about this. It's not like they're taking out $6 billion to do this. It's $100 million.
Yeah.
It seems a lot to the average person, but on a provincial governance scale, that's not really anything.
Yeah, it's unfortunately kind of reflective on how both the government and the public how little they have valued the well-being of our native communities. And that there hasn't been more of a public push for this, and there hasn't been a government initiative to do this earlier is quite terrible. Another thing that we wanted to note a little bit is this was lauded by literally everyone, even Brian Jean, who, if you know anything about Brian Jean, he's not generally a fan of increases in government spending, let's just say that. Lauded this move was a hiring of additional prosecutors. Increase of hiring 50 Crown prosecutors and 30 support staff. Some people are saying that we need to hire a few more judges. And this is all because there is a huge backlog nationwide in court cases.
Yeah, and the thing I think a lot of people don't realize is it's not just a backlog, i.e. somebody sits in jail, not prison, for an extended period of time. Oh, we're getting like a Seinfeld,
Oh, boy. Oh boy, this is great.
But anyway, you're not going to just have people sitting in jail longer awaiting trial. This actually leads to stays.
Yes, if those who don't know, if you, in Canada, you have a right to a speedy trial. You cannot just be left in limbo for an indefinite period of time while your case waits in the queue to be heard. If it's put in the queue for too long, the charges simply get dropped. So that's what has happened in a few cases because we have a huge backlog and deficit of staff. It's the shortage in our justice system.
Now, not to scare people, we're not talking about like murderers or rapists or something getting loose here. These are usually cases that are just they're considered fairly minor, that they're being stayed. But that still are people who have been charged and should rightly have some sort of hearing to account for what they've been charged with, that have just been, because of lack of resources, let go and let to continue their regular lives. So
yeah, the reasons behind this backlog are, we won't get into them a huge amount, but the mandatory minimum sentencing laws put in under the Harper government are a factor when you have these Teflon crime initiatives putting more people into the justice system. That's going to obviously put a burden on it.
Yeah, because without mandatory minimum sentencing, police and other people in the justice system have the freedom of pushing community service and other things as a way of restitution for what they're being accused of.
Yeah, definitely. So that's a positive note, praised by literally all that is an item in this budget. Let's talk a little bit more about the critiques of the budget and, in general, about deficit spending, because I think we've hit most of the main, bullet points of the budget.
So as I said earlier, one of the biggest pushbacks against this budget is that $10 billion deficit.
Yes.
Which, considering our revenue, that is almost 25% of revenue. That's like 20 to 25%, 22.5%, I guess.
Your math is off. It's a $45 billion revenue. and a $10 million deficit. That's less than 25.
Yeah.
Oh, you're
20
right.
to 25.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
in that range.
I was going off of expenditures.
Yes.
It's less than 20% of our expenditures.
No, it's about to 20%. It's just like 18 or whatever percent of our expenditure.
We're arguing about percentages.
Yeah.
This is riveting radio. We are two nerds arguing about the percentages
money.
as a portion of revenue versus expenditure.
But this is what you get when you're talking about the budget, and
this is the budget extravaganza.
This is what you're getting with the two conservative opposition parties to the NDP in Alberta, because the Liberals kind of are opposition, but they're probably not fighting on this budget really.
Well, they also don't barely exist.
Yeah.
Do they have an MLA?
They have one, don't they?
They have one,
because the doctor, is
the guy. The name of the guy that we don't know because he's so important in Alberta politics.
Swan, I think.
Yeah, so I thought I was going to say Swan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah. So you have both the Conservatives and the Wild Rose, who might have some interesting news coming up, given Kenny.
Yep. Given that, yes.
But they're coming together and they're definitely criticizing this budget, mostly on what they would call reckless spending and insufficient tax cuts to help businesses because of the economies, things like that.
Yes. So our deficit and our debt as a province are not at alarming levels right now. If you compare it to other provinces, when you look at the debt to GDP ratio, it's still lowest in Canada. So it's generally not a good idea to borrow a lot of money, but we're not at huge red flag alarming levels. That doesn't mean that it might not be a good idea to spend. That's just a note that our debt to GDP ratio is still fairly low. The debt to GDP ratio, by the way, is a fairly universally accepted measure of a government's ability to pay off and to shoulder a debt.
So talking about the debt to GDP, we're sitting at 6%.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, Quebec, you can make fun of them a lot when you're talking about finances, but they're at 49%. But even the vast majority of Canadian provinces are sitting above 30%.
Yes.
I mean, it's only BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan that are sitting below that.
Yes.
And Alberta is still the lowest by a huge margin.
Well, not a huge margin, because Saskatchewan's at 8.
Yeah, true.
I mean.
But below the 30%.
Below average by a lot.
Yes.
And the lowest, in a grouping of two provinces at a low level, we're low.
Yeah.
Is the main...
Fiscally, we're doing quite well compared to a lot of other provinces.
Yeah, so I understand the concerns about increasing debt load and increasing debt servicing costs. Mm-hmm. But here's my thought, and I've read a lot of articles arguing this. Interest rates right now are quite low. Mm-hmm. Throughout the board. Because of the recession, one of the ways that banks and public lawmakers do in order to try to kickstart the economy is they lower interest rates. Mm-hmm. Interest rates right now are about the lowest they've ever really been.
Yeah.
Both in the States and Canada. Because of that, the cost of borrowing right now is quite low. Mm-hmm. So, it is a good time. If you're going to borrow money, now it's a good time. And if you can borrow money and spend it and invest it in something that has a higher rate of return than your cost of borrowing, then you make money. Right? That's classic, economic. And a lot of this infrastructure stuff that we're talking about, modernization of hospitals, looking long-term, education, water, to native communities, all these things are going to have a positive economic impact on the communities that these changes and improvements are made for a long time. You put a new hospital down, that hospital is going to be there 50 to 100 years, serving the community. People are going to be working there. People are going to have better medical care, be able to get back to work sooner. There's so many economic benefits to that.
Yeah. And I mean, even a simple case of modernizing a building helps a lot in terms of even the operating costs of that building day to day.
Yeah, this argument is a little bit more direct when you're talking about more classic infrastructure such as roads and bridges.
Yeah.
But still, better education, schools, like, those have positive economic benefits for a long period of time after you spend the money to build the school. That school will have a positive economic benefit for years and years and years. Yeah. And so that's where I am a little bit less hawkish on spending than some, because I do not really see deficit spending as a negative in of itself. it's a negative if you're not using that money wisely. The stuff that provincial government is putting towards new hospitals, new schools, the water program, the justice ministers, all these things seem to me like good programs. I may be mistaken. Maybe the hospital isn't needed. Maybe these are extraneous things that aren't really going to help long term. But they certainly seem like the type of things that will help long term, will have a positive impact on the community. And overall, in long term, the rate of return should be higher than the cost of borrowing.
And if we want to talk about direct results of this bill, it's creating about 2,500 jobs straight up.
Yes.
And that's another thing to consider is oftentimes when people start saying, economy's doing poorly, cut spending, if you follow the money, what that ultimately means is people are losing their jobs. Because a lot of the government spending, you're not just paying to buy, like, physical things. A lot of times you're paying for people's time, i.e. paying people to work.
Yes, a lot of teachers and healthcare workers, mostly when you're talking about the provincial government. The biggest expenditures of the provincial government are healthcare and education. Yes. When you combine those two, those are by far the majority of provincial spending. So if you're going to cut, you're going to cut for one of those areas. That means you're going to have less teachers. That means you're going to have
fewer.
Higher class sizes. I'm ignoring you now. That means you're going to have less nurses. That means you're going to have fewer healthcare workers of every sort. Yep. Which, given the concerns people already have about class sizes in Alberta, about waiting room times in emergency rooms, you can cut from those, but you're not going to be happy with the results.
No.
You're going to have teachers move out of province, not paying taxes. Like, it's not going to really help the economy at all.
No, Alberta does have an interesting healthcare system going into that a little bit, in that, like, compared to Saskatchewan, let's say, we do spend comparatively more and have longer wait times, regardless. Yes. So there is still probably some inefficiencies to iron out.
Yes.
But those aren't just budgetary cuts. I believe those take a lot more in terms of research and understanding of how the system works, and maybe even in some situations a reworking of our system in some way.
Yes, we've tried that a couple times. I will tell you, as a person who has a lot of family members in healthcare, we have rejiggered and reorganized the healthcare systems a couple times in recent years. Yeah. And apparently that still hasn't worked. One interesting thing to note about that is that we do, as a country, we spend a little bit more than a lot of developed nations for middling results.
In healthcare
outcomes. And the federal government wanted to solve this by earmarking certain amounts of their transfer payments. If you don't know, the federal government does not directly provide healthcare. It provides money to the provinces in order to provide healthcare. Mm-hmm.
This is why where I'm from, Ontario, the healthcare system is quite a bit different than Alberta's in terms of operation and all sorts of things.
Yes, there's all sorts of slight and sometimes significant differences in delivery. So the federal government earmarked a certain percentage of their transfer payments in the latest deal towards two areas that they felt would increase healthcare outcomes, provide a lot more bang for their buck than what they're spending on now. Those are home care and mental health services. There was a bit of a drama about this. It's an interesting deal that is kind of an aside, but it still has to do with budgetary and government.
And we'll be getting to the federal budget soon.
All right. We're probably spending way too much time and boring everyone. But, so the federal government, you weren't aware of this story before I told you about it. No, the federal government, premiers and the prime minister, or the federal government, I'm not sure if the prime minister there was a finance minister, but that's not important. So the federal government put a deal towards the provinces, increase in spending towards transfer payments towards the province, certain amount of percentage per year, but we'll give you this money, but it has to be towards home care and mental health services. None of the provinces took it. After, a few months, then they started making a deal with each province and kind of picking them off one by one, separating them from the herd as they were. And all of them ended up taking that same deal, except I believe Quebec, which it's Quebec.
It's Quebec.
So it's their own thing, but they took the deal, they took the money, and they said, you don't tell us to spend the money on these two things, but we choose to.
You gotta maintain that independence.
And you are a sovereign nation in our nation, Quebec, and never forget that.
Oh, you be you. You be you, Quebec.
All right. Let's talk a bit about taxation, because that would be another way, besides reducing spending, another way to decrease our budget. Because if you look at our tax rates... Decrease
our what?
A deficit.
Deficit, yes.
Sorry. When you look at our tax rates compared to the other provinces, generally they're low, especially when you look at income taxes. So yeah, when you look at especially our top marginal rate, that's the income tax rate of the highest income bracket, it's pretty much the lowest in the province. It's slightly higher by...
Lowest of the provinces.
Yeah. It's technically higher than BC by 0.30%. But there's some room where we could have increased that by a little bit.
Yeah.
Or increased the corporate tax. You could have done some things. Added a PSD, which is something we've talked about. I don't like ever talking about, but it's definitely a possibility.
Yeah. No, our taxes across the board are either the lowest or amongst the lowest for sure. I mean, even our gasoline tax, which is still the lowest, if you add on the carbon charge, it's still not that insane.
It's still around 3 cents more than the lowest and still lower than Quebec and Newfoundland.
Yeah.
So there's some room there, especially when you compare it to the other provinces, to increase our revenues by increasing taxes. So that's a bit of a critique I have of the budget.
All right.
I think we should move on. We spent way too much time. You've bored our audience. Let's bore our audience some more, though, by talking about the national budget. Woo!
So, in our national budget, we're looking at other numbers, bigger numbers.
Ooh.
So, we're sitting at about $305 billion in revenue for the country, and we're spending about $330 billion. So, of course, those are rounded off over here and there. So, we're actually sitting at about $28.5 billion in deficit. This is interesting because the government, when it formed, promised $10 billion per year.
And this is higher.
This is much bigger than $10 billion.
For those of you who are not great at math.
18.5 billion bigger.
I think that's good. We spent enough time. we need to start
kicking this off.
Kicking it a bit briefer.
All right. So going into the nitty gritty, the deficits are still hoping to decline over the next 5 years.
Yep.
But where we're spending money is we're spending a bunch on a national housing strategy, a bunch on childcare, as we said, a little bit more for defense, just for upgrading equipment.
I think that's existing spending, actually.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, a little existing, but this budget is pretty close to the same. There are some big changes in new money. One of the biggest being the $3.4 billion in new money over 5 years that is going to infrastructure, health, and education for Indigenous communities. Once again, we're hitting this.
Yeah, when you look at Indigenous health outcomes, when you look at funding for Indigenous schools, they're worse. The government spends less per student on Indigenous students than non-Indigenous students, specifically that deals with on-reserve. When you look at healthcare outcomes, they're worse. The Native populations have a lot more healthcare problems than the rest of the population. So this is long overdue funding.
Yeah. No, once again, compared to the overall size of the budget, it's not that much. It's honestly feels pretty similar to the $100 million we're spending provincially.
Yeah.
But this is still very necessary funding, and it's all new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's some focus on skills and development of occupational skills. There's a lot of focus on the budget on innovation, a lot of on startups, on superclusters. Do you want to talk a bit about superclusters?
So, yeah. Before we looked into this too deeply, we were really curious what superclusters. Yeah, as the first thing I thought was something celestial, but the government is not sponsoring aliens. What it's actually doing is basically Silicon Valley in Canada. That's what they're trying to sponsor. An arguably good use of money, arguably bad use of money.
I'm not sure about this.
But around the Toronto area, between Toronto and Waterloo, where in Waterloo there are some very high-tech or at least very STEM-oriented things.
Yes, as well, the University of Waterloo is a world-class institute in the fields of computer science.
Yeah. And then there's also the Perimeter Institute, which I actually went to once,
Ooh.
which is a building focused on theoretical physics and the analysis thereof. So it's a bunch of nerds in a building with chalkboards everywhere, puzzling through stuff. It's really cool. Super high, high in the STEM area, but definitely something that would be, good for a Silicon Valley area tech development for sure.
Yeah, so they're trying to get a lot more high-tech startups into Canada. And, I mean, this is something I think that a lot of the Canadian government has wanted for a while. We'll see if they're successful. I'm a little bit skeptical. The amount of money, it's almost $1.95 billion over 5 years to support these super clusters. We'll see how effective that is in it's the kind of thing that if it is effective, it will create a lot of new jobs and be a great investment, but it's also has the possibility of really just fizzling out.
Yeah, no, you of course run into the arguments about if we don't diversify, if we don't try to keep up with the times, we'll go the way of coal.
Yeah.
Right? Which, as much as right now, coal has had some, environmental pressures pushed against it, and it's really more expensive to produce. It's been dying for a long time.
Yes.
So you've got to upgrade or diversify or die is how it works on the world stage.
Yep. So there is the pros and cons in that. There's a $50 million toward teaching children to code and a $125 million towards a Canadian artificial intelligence strategy.
Which just sounds so cool, and combining those two makes me just think that we're going to build Skynet.
Maybe we will build Skynet. Maybe this budget will be looked at for generations as the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it.
Maybe. Canada will bring about our downfall with our amazing AI coded by kids.
That is at very least a movie I would watch.
It would be very awesome.
Okay.
No, there are still some things that are a little more controversial about this.
Yeah.
There is talk about, we're increasing the sin tax. Albeit that is true. We're talking a cent per, bottle of wine, 5 cents for 2-4. This isn't anything you'll really even notice.
The 2-4. I never used the term 2-4. You know that?
No?
No, is that...
You're not Canadian enough, eh?
I don't go, but I gotta go get a 2-4. Actually, I don't generally get a 2-4. But if I'm buying beer, I generally buy it in 12 packs.
Yeah, you buy the Blanche de Chambly or whatever.
Because I'm not buying Emulsion Canadian because I have a soul. Wow, I sound elitist
where's your brokenness, Brent? Where's your my AGD 2-4 in the cupboard that just basically ran out?
Is it you bought an AGD 2-4?
I bought an AGD 2-4, so
that's good to know.
Anyway, syntax is not going up much.
No, it's going up 5 cents on the aforementioned 2-4. 1 cent on a bottle of wine. Parental leave is also going up to 18 months.
Yep.
They're
which will obviously cost money.
Yes. They're putting a GST on Uber.
That is a big one, especially considering, now granted, Uber isn't cheaper than taxis, but it still is considered a fairly reasonable outcome, or alternative. And if you start adding, in Ontario, the tax is 13%. It gets up there. It adds a fair bit.
This doesn't matter for us, because we don't have Uber here, do we?
No, Uber lost the battle here.
And the Uber lost against the taxi here. We have,
Tapcar.
Tapcar is which I did the research into and is actually owned by the taxi companies.
Oh.
Yeah, I told you this earlier.
Oh, okay.
The people that own Tapcar, which is basically the Uber, it's like Lyft, it's like Uber, it's very much like that, except I think the company owns the car somehow.
Okay, no, that's because that's how they emblazon it and whatever.
Yeah.
But,
and that, anyway, the money and the funding from that comes from a couple people who were heavily involved in the taxi industry before. So it's not really a
pretty little bit of corruption.
It's not really an alternative to taxis. Let's just say that.
Yeah. We don't have Uber here, but that is something that will affect Canadians at large.
Yes. Another thing that we'll briefly mention is naloxone, which is an antidote to fentanyl. It has been put as tax-free and been deregulated as a prescription drug in emergency circumstances. This is important as we talked about the fentanyl crisis a few weeks earlier, so we're just going to briefly mention that.
And I think a final kind of interesting note about this budget is actually they are looking at selling and privatizing a bunch of Canadian airports.
Yeah.
Which, once again, when you start privatizing things on that scale that are not public goods per se, but kind of. Because currently all the airports are run by non-for-profits, so if you start selling them to for-profit organizations, you start to run the risk of getting into sketchy territory. I mean, we're not privatizing prisons here, but
Yeah.
it's something that's a little dicey and interesting for sure to come from a liberal government.
This hasn't been confirmed yet. This is just kind of rumors. Because a lot of stuff has kind of been put on hold. This budget is basically just an update from the previous budget. The main excuse for this is because so much is up in the air with the U.S. Tax reform has not happened under a Trump government. We have no idea what the Trump tax system has looked like. And because we are competing with the U.S. for the same mines, for the same corporation headquarters space.
Yeah.
That's the kind of as well. The other thing is that we're not sure how exactly U.S. trade policy will affect us. Trump has said he would like to renegotiate NAFTA, and that, of course, will greatly affect us if we turn out on the wrong end of that. So, because of that, this is a bit of a holding pattern. And there's a bit of argument over whether it's a holding pattern due to necessity or because it's politically convenient to do so.
Yeah.
That is the critique from the NDP side is that they could be doing more to increase taxes, to put spending into some areas
That are needed.
But they're just holding off because it's politically convenient and not because of that. The critique from the Conservative side is, of course, too much spending.
Well, and looking at the deficit compared to their promise, their campaign promise, It is not at all close.
Yeah.
So there is definitely that issue, and you can blame it on all sorts of things, but fact remains, we are spending far more than we're getting, and that's what creates the deficit.
Exactly. So, yeah, I'm not sure. It does seem to me, my opinion is that the Trump administration is a very convenient excuse in order to hang a lot of this out, to kind of just keep up the status quo, which has kind of been the MO of the current government, for sure.
No, and when it really comes to this, as we were discussing earlier today, Justin Trudeau's definitely out of his honeymoon period. People are definitely starting to criticize him more heavily, and at least for myself, I'm not in love with everything. I mean, for this budget, I don't see anything that's grievously wrong about it I mean, the deficit is perhaps a little worrying, but overall, I'm not really concerned about this. But there's nothing I love about it either, other than, honestly, the Aboriginal spending, which has been waiting forever.
Yeah.
Everything else,
It's budget. It's a budget.
Yeah, exactly.
They're, spending money on things. They're helping the middle class, if you believe their press releases. Whereas the Conservatives are fighting for the taxpayer, and the NDP are fighting for, again, I suppose, the middle
social welfare, and
it's political rhetoric.
Politics, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's about all we have. Honestly, I would say that this budget is the most boring out of all of them.
Yeah.
Unless you really want to debate the Uber tax for another half hour, which I don't really want to do.
No.
So, speaking of...
interesting budgets.
And speaking of Trump, which we mentioned.
Let's go to his proposed budget in international news.
Oh, and we also have some breaking news as of like an hour ago.
Ooh! So, once again, I'm going to start the discussion off. However, in this budget, there's a lot of mandatory spending, not much, or only about a third of it is discretionary. So I'm not going to be talking about the overall budget numbers.
Yeah, so let's. I'm going to clarify what you're saying by this.
Okay.
So, about 2/3 of the U.S. government is done by Medicaid and social welfare stuff.
Yeah.
That is deemed as mandatory spending.
And unemployment, all that.
And all that kind of stuff. And that is mandatory spending, and that is very difficult for a president to change on his own without getting a lot of bills through Congress, Senate, working with the states. It's very complex in order to deal with that. So this only concerns about a third of the U.S. budget, which is deemed as discretionary spending.
Mm-hmm. So, basically, when we look at the American budget, there's a few things, there's one major trend that we notice. Anything almost to do with the military gets a huge boost, and everything else gets a huge cut, and the majority of the heavy cuts are towards environmental stuff or towards just general STEM stuff. So, when we talk about it, the defense budget which in America, out of the discretionary spending, so we're talking about only about the third that he's really changing here. The defense budget is a huge amount of the budget. We're $520 billion. And he's increasing it by $50 billion.
Yeah. Now, it's important to note that this budget is not binding. It's merely a suggestion that will make its way through Congress and the Senate. As bills get proposed, this is a guideline-type document as opposed to the budget that we talked about earlier, which is literally what the government is going to do and is currently doing.
This one here is going to get decided over, and we will talk later about how the different aspects of the American government are reacting to this budget.
Yes.
But, as it stands, what Trump's proposition is to increase by like 10% the defense budget, which is already massive. Two of the largest cuts by the percentage of the agency's budget are going to be from the EPA, which is taking a 31% cut.
Yeah, which is huge.
And state and other development programs, which a lot of that is international aid. So this budget is gutting both the EPA, which, I mean, Trump has there was actually talk earlier on about him actually trying to force the EPA to remove all mention of climate change from their website, which, as last I saw, was still up. However, him pushing that and pushing the removal of all these sorts of climate change initiatives, which are completely losing federal funding, and then all of a sudden, a bunch of international aid is losing funding. You know,
some of that international funding is also going to international climate change research organizations. Yeah. Another big cut in health and human services. They are slashing the fund dramatically of the National Institute of Health. National Institute of Health funds a large portion of the science done in the States and has been instrumental in a huge amount of discoveries around, figuring out vaccines for Ebola. You'd be surprised how much I have a lot of chemistry background, and you'd be surprised how much the National Institute of Health shows up on chemistry papers, because the chemistry
in Canada.
Well, not in Canada.
American papers, but you've seen this in Canada.
I'm seeing this. This is affecting a lot of,
internationally,
because a lot of chemistry involves making molecules for pharmaceutical use. The National Institute of Health's checkbook is all around chemistry papers.
Yeah.
It's one of the largest funding organizations for science in the world.
And another interesting thing about his plan is, so I talked about the EPA being gutted, and there is things that there also will specifically affect Canada. We've got the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, right?
Yes.
And we've got those kind of climate programs that will affect the borders. There's also one about infrastructure assistance on the Mexican border that affects that. And an interesting thing to kind of compare to the Canadian plan is that there's an elimination of the infrastructure assistance to Alaska Native villages, which is almost converse to what Canada's doing with their increase of spending. He's eliminating federal spending in that area.
Yeah, there's a lot of elimination of programs for housing, for school programs, for all sorts of programs for low-income people.
Low-income seniors, those are all getting hit.
Meals on Wheels, with one of the higher-profile ones that getting hit. Meals on Wheels is a program that, again, is low cost and pretty much pays for itself because it allows seniors to live on their own and not have to live in expensive nursing homes, which cost the system much more money.
Yeah. So even if you're looking at a pure, cold, clinical, financial perspective, there's a lot of decisions in this budget that don't make a whole lot of sense.
No, that doesn't. You're looking at it, and the increases are to things that defense, more jets, the U.S. is probably not going to be fighting a war with Russia anytime soon, despite the chilly relationship and the cyber attacks on U.S. elections. Mm-hmm. The U.S. is not the primary instigator involved in the war on ISIS.
Yep.
The defense spending will be essentially for show.
Yep.
And if you look, say World War III come hurtling across right now, Russia, China, let's say, North Korea against the West, whatever. The U.S. has the military to cream those three pretty much on their own. Never mind the combined forces of Britain, France, Japan, Canada. I only mentioned Canada because we're from Canada. It has a terrible military comparatively. You're looking at all of these countries, it's not going to happen. And if it does, we have the strategic advantage.
Yeah, and I mean, the increases for defense there, I don't think they're really tenable. And then even veteran affairs, once again, that's probably really good spending because veterans are notoriously ill-funded in terms of the veteran affairs.
Yes, what I don't know, veteran affairs mostly covers veterans hospitals and pensions.
Yeah. So that definitely needs more funding. But when you're talking about Homeland Security, it's interesting. He's increasing spending a whole bunch, mostly with the southern border and with Mexico.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, is reducing funding from counterterrorism initiatives and flood relief kind of stuff. Like, Homeland Security isn't just military threats. It deals with kind of all sorts of dangers to the American people.
Yeah.
And floods are incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
And a whole flood system, a warning system is getting gutted. And I think what the most damning thing to me are all the really small programs, or small agencies. These agencies cost very little. Some of them are well under $1 billion. Yet still, they're getting completely cut from federal funding. And I know people specifically that are having issues with the National Endowment for the Arts or for the Humanities. Those are completely losing federal funding under this proposed budget.
Yeah, basically all arts funding, both for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which does PBS, NPR kind of stuff, and the organizations you mentioned, those are entirely eliminated.
Interesting thing also with Donald Trump's proposed help with coal populations. There's the Appalachian Regional Commission. Now, this currently funds programs to develop economic opportunities, infrastructure, and the workforce in 13 Appalachian states, with much of its work focused on coal-dependent communities. So this is a specific agency looking to help communities being hurt by the downfall of coal. And Donald Trump has gone into these states and into these communities proposing to help them out, and this specific budget cuts the funding for that.
Do you know a couple states that were instrumental in the election of Donald Trump? Name a couple of them. Name a couple ones that weren't expected to swing his way, but ended up going his way.
Oh, I mean, Florida's always kind of...
They're close to... Let's say they're close to us.
Oh, okay. You're talking about the northwestern kind of states.
Midwest. I'm talking specifically about Minnesota and Michigan.
Okay.
Those were not expected to swing his way. What major body of water do they board?
Oh, the Great Lakes.
Exactly. Do you think that the people that voted for Donald Trump will appreciate the fact that they're ending the effort to clean up their lakes? Lakes that they depend on for drinking water? Yeah. Lakes that they, like to swim in?
Yeah.
Like, this budget just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, and I mean, when you're talking about, now granted, obviously conservatives generally don't like a lot of spending, and some of the initiatives for poor people do take a hit. But there are tons of stories, I mean, with the healthcare thing, which we'll talk in later.
Yeah.
But people who voted for Trump that didn't realize that his policies are going to cut out things they literally depend on.
Although, I think this is about all we really have to say about the budget. I mean, you can look up more granular on what all of the agencies that will get cut if this budget ends up going through, which, we won't.
No.
Nobody really likes it. A lot of even Republican nominators.
Yeah, the Republicans are hating it currently. It's not going anywhere, but it's interesting to see where Trump's mind is at with
exactly. It's interesting to note that we have breaking news. I teased this earlier, but I've been following the story as it breaks throughout the day. While we were prepping, I was checking this.
All right, give it to me.
All right, so people may be aware of the new healthcare bill, the American Healthcare Act, right?
I believe
that's what it's called, because the original one was the Affordable
Care Act.
The Affordable Care Act. This is the American Healthcare Act, and this was a bill pushed through by Trump. Paul Ryan was a big proponent of it. I believe he's heavily involved in the writing of the bill. It got pulled from the Congress because they did not have the votes. It was kind of a disaster from the beginning. When people looked at the bill, they found many people would lose healthcare and become uninsured. Up to, I believe, 26 million was the Congressional Budget Office estimate. So the conservatives didn't like it because it was too much like Obamacare, and because it kept a lot of the Obamacare provisions. The moderates didn't like it. I'm talking specifically about GOP lawmakers, because basically every Democrat was voting against this.
Yes.
And moderate Democrats didn't like it because a lot of their constituents would become uninsured and lose health care.
Yeah.
And if you're a congressman representing an area and a bunch of people lose health care, they're probably not going to vote for you if you voted for the bill. Yeah. So because of those reasons, there was a lot of GOP lawmakers that voted against it. This is despite a lot of attempted deal making by the art of the deal man himself, Donald Trump, and the very boring looking Paul Ryan.
Who the internet is in love with.
Are they?
Yeah, they like Paul Ryan.
What? Who on the internet likes Paul Ryan?
Really? Yeah,
Paul Ryan?
Paul Ryan and Rand Paul are like the internet's...
Are you thinking of Rand Paul, not Paul Ryan?
Paul Ryan and Rand Paul are...
Are you just talking about Reddit?
Yes.
Okay. That makes sense now. Reddit likes very fiscally conservative people sometimes. Mm-hmm. Very fiscally conservative libertarians. Like the Bernier buzz.
Yeah.
We get to feel the burn the second time. It's great. Anyway, that's a digression. I think that's about all we have to say about that. We managed to get through 3 budgets in like an hour. So thank us for the brevity of this, okay? Let's move on to something a little bit lighter. Something that's doesn't task our brain so much.
Lighter?
So let's talk about your paleontology breakthrough, because that is very intellectually not demanding, right?
Alright, on to news that, doesn't matter. Alright, I'm gonna have all the excitement for this segment.
Okay.
I'm super... So,
Can I have none of the excitement?
You can have none of the excitement and all the cynicism and sarcasm.
Okay, I'm ready.
I give you that. So, there has been a, now this isn't set in stone, pardon the pun. But, there has been a paper released in Nature. So this isn't like some rinky-dink little backwater journal.
This isn't the broke paleontology journal of Upper Edmonton.
Yes. This is actually...
Can we create the broke paleontology journal of Upper Edmonton?
I might have to talk to some people about
Okay.
Anyways.
Can I interrupt 5 more times?
Only if you correct my semantics.
Okay.
So, this article is released, and this is a study done on a bunch of different physical characteristics on a whole bunch of fossils. And by their analysis, the traditional held family tree, you could call it, of dinosaurs is going to be kind of not turned upside down per se, but radically shifted. So, historically, and if you grew up learning about dinosaurs, you probably would know this, there's a major division early on in dinosaurs that we believe. And that's the ornithischians and the saurischians.
Okay, now... I talked about this change earlier, but now I'd like you to not use technical species names, but only refer to dinosaurs by their representatives in the animated movie Land Before Time.
Okay. So Land Before Time nomenclature. The ornithischians. This group includes Ducky and Sarah, alright, and Spike. These are what we call the bird hip dinosaurs.
You can use the term bird hip, that's okay.
Yeah, bird hip. Now, we say this because the pelvic bones, right? Basically, if you look at them from the side, I'm trying to be overly simple.
Okay.
The bird hip dinosaurs, they both point backwards to both of the lower ones, the ischium and the pubis. Whereas in...
Pubis.
Yes. Guess what? That relates to pubic area, okay? And in the saurischians, they almost do one goes forward, one goes backwards, alright? So if you look at it from the side, either both go back or they split off. Okay, so the ornithischians, which includes, as I said, Sarah, Spike, and Ducky, those were, we thought, branched off one way, alright, and going back all to the root. The other branch included the saurischians, which did the split. And these ones included sharp tooth, right? These
Okay.
are the theropods here, as well as Bigfoot, or not
Bigfoot is the name of, I think, the one.
No, Littlefoot.
It's Littlefoot. Okay, it's been a while since I saw this movie.
As well as Littlefoot, who is the sauropod, the long-necked dinosaur, right?
Okay.
So the way we originally believed is actually Littlefoot and Spike, or Sharptooth, are more closely related than the two of them are to any of the others.
Okay.
All right. So if you were drawing this out as a family tree, now this big shakeup. Now, it includes a group called the Herrerasaurids, which, for the longest time, people have been arguing where they fit in this whole thing. Now, these are dinosaurs that featured in the Triassic, which is the very earliest point at where dinosaurs showed up.
Do I know any species from this particular group?
You do not know any Herrerasaurids, and you probably don't know any dinosaur from the Triassic, probably. These are very primitive dinosaurs. The Jurassic is where you get a lot of your big dinosaurs. In late Jurassic, you get Brachiosaurus. Allosaurus and Apatosaurus are from your Jurassic. Cretaceous is where all the sexy dinosaurs are from, right? So Velociraptor, T-Rex, all those are from the Cretaceous.
So what you're saying is that Triassic World, if it was going to be accurate to the science, would not sell very many movie tickets.
No. Triassic World would be horribly selling because nobody knows any dinosaurs. Now, Herrerasaurus is a carnivorous dinosaur. And I agreed with the scientist that held that he was basally joined to these sauropods, like Littlefoot. So,
explain the term basally.
To the base. So basically, if you go back, follow their trees to their common ancestor, I thought he was most closely related, Herrerasaurids, were most closely related to sauropods.
Okay.
And a lot of scientists agree with that. Now, we actually have a cladogram.
What is a cladogram, and what does it have to do with clades?
Okay, so phylogenetic tree and cladograms, in very basic sense, you probably think of them pretty much similar. Phylogenetic trees are your family tree. Okay. Basically, think of it like that.
Okay, so like classic origin of species, the branches of the species that go places.
Yeah. But actually, kind of. They're more like how they're related to each other.
Yeah.
Cladograms deal with the actual clades, i.e. in the Linnaean classification, how you divide them. So, kingdom, phylum, order, that whole thing.
Okay.
Right? So, when you're talking about which group animals are in the same family or the same order, you're looking at their clades there, alright?
Okay, so it's the cladogram is more simplified in grouping than a phylogenetic tree.
Yeah, phylogenetic tree is related to the relationships, whereas the cladogram is more focused on their classification. Okay? But they're, in a very layman's sense, they'd be fairly similar. So don't worry about it.
Alright, I'm not worried about it. I will probably forget most of this.
So, when you look at the cladogram, the phylogenetic tree, whatever have you, we'll say, you normally, as I said, Littlefoot and Sharptooth, they first come together.
Okay.
And then if you follow that back, then you find the common ancestor between them and Spike and Ducky and what's the other one?
Sarah.
Sarah the Triceratops.
I have a strong urge to watch The Land Before Time now, but just the first one.
All right, that's the best one. The other ones are other crap.
There's like 20 of them.
There are 20, and they're.
How many of those have you seen?
Too many, and I think it's like 3.
Wow, 3 is too many.
Yeah, oh boy. They're actually, complete aside, there's Lindsay Ellis does an amazing retrospective on all of them.
I think I watched that. No, that wasn't Lindsay Ellis.
That was Lindsay.
No, that was Mars Girl.
Oh, that was Mars Girl, maybe.
That was definitely Mars Girl and not Lindsay Ellis.
Anyway, on the internet, somebody does a great recap of all of them because they get progressively worse and worse. But the way that we think the phylogenetic tree is arranged now is actually that Sharptooth might be most related to Ducky.
Okay.
And to Sarah and to Spike.
Okay.
And then those two, being the most related, then come back and then relate to Littlefoot. So Littlefoot might be
more closely related to the dinosaurs we've never heard of.
The Herrerasaurids. Exactly.
Wow, this is so exciting and will affect my life in every way.
But here's the thing. If you read any book as a kid about dinosaurs, the first thing they teach you is the big division between the Ornithischians and the Saurischians.
Ooh.
That division might not actually be an actual division anymore because the Ornithischians, if you look at this, split off 2 of the groups of the Saurischians that we have.
Oh.
So, that's looking at a bunch of different traits, some of which are on the skull, some of which are on different parts.
So they're just looking at fossils and being like, so this species has a bone length from here to here at this point, and then this species, or like...
Kind of. It's more looking at like specific traits, and it's not a measurement.
It's more of a ratio?
No, it's not a ratio. It's a binary thing. Do they have it or do they not?
Okay.
Usually.
So do they have this particular bone?
Yeah.
Do they have this particular finger bone? Do they have this
like
particular...
where you think like humans and chimpanzees, we both pretty much have opposable thumbs, right? So that would be a trait we share.
Okay.
But then if you go back earlier to like, some form of lemur, they wouldn't have that.
Okay.
So this is how we determine...
Chimps evolved from lemurs?
Well, lemurs and chimps... Modern lemurs and chimps share a common ancestor.
Which were kind of basically lemurs, but old lemurs.
Kind of.
They were kind of lemurs.
This is where it depends on how you define your clades, right? It's like saying we're kind of fish. So to shorten this up,
okay,
this is a big change.
I don't want to define my clades incorrectly. Yeah. That's where you get into issues.
This is a big change, though. What it basically means is a lot, and I mean literally, we're talking over 100 years of what we thought about dinosaurs could be wrong.
Wow.
This is a huge change up. You may not know much about it, but there's a Nature article written for the plebeian.
I am definitely a plebeian, which I believe belongs to the clade of
Rome.
Rome.
Plebeian is from a Roman term. Anyways.
Okay.
For those of you who don't know much about dinosaurs, I would still recommend looking up the Nature article.
Okay.
And pay attention to this. Now, granted, we've had talks similar to this about different Triceratops actually being the same species.
Good old Sarah.
Species as another dinosaur that Torosaurus you wouldn't know about, and just being different ages. However, some of these things come to play, some of these things don't, and some of them are argued about forever. So we'll have to see where this one sits.
Okay.
But this research is fairly compelling and fairly groundbreaking, if it's true.
Okay. Well, that is I kid, but that is rather fascinating. Despite my cynicism and sarcasm and constant interruption and reduction of it to animated Don Bluth movie terms.
You know what? That Don Bluth movie, the original, was fantastic, so I don't really hate that.
I haven't seen it in so long. You know what Don Bluth movie I really like, though? The Secret of Nim. That was a great movie.
That is a fantastic
That's a great movie. I think this is the part of the show where we're just kind of talking and rambling, and I think at this point, I can hear the music playing. Can you?
I think I hear it. I guess we have to quickly say goodbye before it stops.
Fight Nazis, I guess? I don't know. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.